in the late 70s, early 80s in the US, there was this move for a program by NASA called the Great Observatories program. So the Great Observatories were meant to be several, and in fact, eventually 4 space telescopes that would overcome the difficulties of doing astronomy from the ground. Now, the Hubble Space Telescope is the most famous version of that, where, again, optical light certainly reaches the ground, and we have ground-based telescopes, but obviously looking through the atmosphere where it wobbles and so on, it doesn't give you the clearest images. But also the Hubble Space Telescope was sensitive to ultraviolet light, which doesn't reach the ground. And so the idea was that, so that was the first one of the great observatories. And then NASA would have 3 more great observatories, each one going to a particular other wavelength region, which is not, detectable or easily detectable from the ground. There was the Compton Gamma Ray Observatory. Again, it's a good thing gamma rays don't reach us to the ground, or if you read comic books, would all be Incredible Hulks, or they're certainly not conducive to life. Similarly, with the Chandra X-ray Observatory, most of our atmosphere absorbs the X-rays, which is great. Not great for astronomy, but great for human and any other kind of life, because you don't want to be just constantly bombarded by X-rays. And the 4th of the great observatories was initially called the Space Infrared Telescope Facility, and which would become renamed the Spitzer Space Telescope. And that one was to work at infrared wavelengths. So these are wavelengths of light that are longer than our eyes can see. And we're usually familiar with infrared light in terms of infrared remotes, like your TV remote and so on. The light that it sends, it communicates with your TV via light, except it's not light your eyes can see. It's a wavelength that it's invisible to you, but it's certainly there. And then and Spitzer actually works even a little bit longer wavelengths than the infrared remotes that we have. And it's very difficult to do infrared astronomy from the ground, not impossible, but one of the difficulties from doing infrared from the ground is the fact that there's water vapor in our atmosphere, which is certainly very good for us in general, but water vapor is very good at absorbing infrared light. And in fact, it's the most common molecule in the air that absorbs infrared and gives us a limited greenhouse effect, which makes the Earth warm enough for us to exist in. Now, we often hear about carbon dioxide as being the infrared absorbing and hence heating and greenhouse gas. It is, and in fact, it's actually, its combination with water vapor is the difficult thing. That is, it absorbs a lot of infrared light as well, and giving us a worse greenhouse effect, which we don't want. But separate from that, all that water vapor in the atmosphere gives us a couple of narrow windows where we can see and observe the universe. But what we want is to observe at multiple wavelengths, lots of different infrared wavelengths of light. And that was the job of Spitzer. The other thing about infrared light, which people may be familiar with, is that we often hear about infrared cameras where you can see things at night, or they're often called night vision cameras. Night vision cameras can operate in one of 2 ways. One is they either amplify whatever the ambient light is, whatever light is available. That's just taking the optical light that our eyes would see and just boosting it. The other way is infrared light. That is, everything that's warm, anything that's warm gives off light, and usually things that are just, a little warm to, fairly, and basically they give off light, and that most of that light often is infrared light. And so the advantage of going into space is the fact that our atmosphere actually emits infrared light. So you don't want to look at the universe through this glowing foreground of our own atmosphere. In addition to the fact that a lot of the water vapor in the atmosphere also absorbs that infrared light coming from space. So the Spitzer Space Telescope was designed to basically overcome all of those things, first by being above the atmosphere, which makes life a lot easier, so you don't have something absorbing that light. And the other part of it is that if it's warm, it will emit its own infrared light. So you're seeing the light from your own telescope as opposed to the stars and the galaxies and everything else that's out there. So what you want is your telescope to be very cold. And one of the advantages of the Spitzer Space Telescope was by being in space is that you can actually cool it down. And that's the image of it floating behind me. And you see that big shield on one side. That shield actually protects it from the sun and makes it very cool on the tube side, the telescope side. On the other side of that shield is a solar panel, so that's how we get our power. But then no sunlight is allowed to fall onto the telescope itself. In addition to that, we carried liquid helium, which is very, very cold. And so we use that to cool the telescope and the instruments within the telescope. So we could be very cold so that we're not emitting any of the light that we hope to detect from things that are not our telescope, from stars, galaxies, and so on. So that was the genesis of the idea. And then the technology, a lot of technological development had to be done to both have it operate the way it was operating at those cold temperatures, although there have been other infrared space observatories. This was very innovative. But then the other part of it was that, once it was launched in 2003, it was in what's called an Earth trailing orbit, because the Earth itself is warm. So we don't want to be next to a warm thing. If we are, then you have to actually expend more of your liquid helium to keep yourself cold. So we're in what's called an Earth trailing orbit. So we basically had the spacecraft give it just enough of a push so that it started drifting away from the Earth in the same orbit as the Earth is in the sun. That is, we're orbiting the sun at 1 year intervals, just like the Earth is, except we were just slowed down a little bit so that we were just getting further and further separated from the Earth. So we didn't get any heat from the Earth. We had the sun shield blocking the sun from the telescope, and we could go down to nearly 5 degrees Kelvin to basically be very cold. So then anything that was warmer than that in the universe, we could detect the light and observe it.